All right, everybody, welcome back. AP Environmental Science. This is the beginning of unit number 2. Now, just kind of a fair warning, unit 2 is a bit shorter than unit 1. However, the topics, in my opinion, don't really flow all that well. So I'm probably, as I go through this with you guys over the next couple of weeks, I'm probably going to be jumping around in Unit 2, just because I think some of the topics um, kind of aren't aligned very well. But that's for me to worry about. Don't worry about it so much for you guys. Pretty much just kind of learn what I teach you, and we should be fine. But we're going to start off today with topic 2.1, which is an introduction to biodiversity. In fact, this whole unit, Unit 2, is pretty much about biodiversity, and we'll be kind of talking about it in different levels and take some different approaches to it. So let's start off today with our notes and let's kind of get a good grasp on what the term biodiversity means. The textbook definition here is the variety of life on Earth at different levels, ranging from genetic, we can look at biodiversity at that level, all the way up to the ecosystem or the habitat level. I talked briefly about this, the first week of school, when I gave you guys the first kind of packet of notes. We talked briefly about genetic diversity and species and ecosystem, and that's kind of the three different angles that we're going to kind of approach it in this particular unit. Now, today, I just want to focus on the genetic level. So some of the stuff that we're going to get into today kind of is going to kind of take you back to your biology days. I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I'm going to hope that some of the terminology that I'm going to be using does sound somewhat familiar. So when we're studying genetic diversity, and one of the things that we kind of have to think about is we're just looking at an individual species, like for example, these cheetahs here. And like when you look at them all, I mean, it's quite obvious that these aren't elephants, or hippopotamuses. I mean, we know that these animals are cheetahs when you look at them. But when you look at them closely, there are some differences between them, right? I mean, for example, this guy in the middle here, he seems to have kind of a little bit of a darker coloration to his fur than, say, this guy over here on the left does. The spot patterns, even though they're similar to each other, they're not exactly the same. Maybe this cheetah over here on the right, maybe this guy is the fastest of all of these cheetahs, right? So there's little individual differences between each one of them. And that's what genetic diversity is all about. I mean, not every single cheetah is exactly the same, right? Some are faster than others. Some have better vision than others. Some have different spots than others do. I mean, whatever. They're going to be a little bit different, but that's a good thing for a species. It's good that all these individuals are a little bit different from each other. For one, that allows a species like cheetahs to adapt to diseases. For example, one of the differences amongst all of these cheetahs is their immune systems are a little bit different. For example, this cheetah on the left, maybe he's kind of a sickly cheetah. He doesn't have the best immune system, whereas maybe these other four over here, maybe their immune systems are a lot better. So if there's a disease that strikes this small population, maybe this guy over here will die, but the other four will live, because they're again genetically superior to him. So if there is genetic diversity, that's kind of a good thing, because if all of these cheetahs had a weak immune system, if they were all exactly the same, then they would all perish. So that wouldn't be a good thing for the species. Another thing too that's good, or that genetic diversity allows, is it allows a species to tolerate change. So if there's any changes in their environment, Maybe a few individuals won't be able to survive, but maybe others will. Again, that's only allowable if there is genetic diversity. So that's kind of a good thing. If individuals in the population die for whatever reason, that's going to result in lower diversity. So let's say, for example, these 5 cheetahs here, these are the only 5 cheetahs within, like, let's say, a 5-mile radius of where they are. Well, if, let's say, 3 of these, cheetahs get, let's say, hunted or killed, then the genetic diversity of that population is going to be lower. It's going to be less because those genes are no longer in the gene pool. You guys might remember that term from biology. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how genetic diversity even happens in the first place. I mean, what actually causes it to happen? There's 2 big processes that I want to talk about today and a little bit more in the next lecture. These are 2 things that, again, you're probably familiar with, but there are ways that genetic diversity happens. The first one is what we call genetic recombination. All that basically means is that genes get shuffled up. Okay. Now, in humans and in a lot of other animals that reproduce sexually, this is not that big of a deal. I mean, every single time 2 individuals mate, the genes get mixed together, and then the new offspring is different. I mean, just for example, all these people here, I mean, this guy in the upper left, whoever this guy is, I mean, his parents obviously had sex one day, and their genes were combined together to produce him. This guy down here in the middle with the beard, I mean, his parents, same thing. Their genes combined together to produce him. So genetic recombination allows for all of these differences amongst all the individuals. And it's the same thing for cheetahs and elephants and any other organism, again, that reproduces sexually. Now, genetic mutation is a little bit different. Genetic mutation is basically when there's just some spontaneous change in the DNA. We'll talk about that more in a couple of minutes. But again, back to recombination. Again, this is just kind of a typical example. Here we have some giraffes. Every single one of these giraffes is a little bit different, but that's all because the parents, when they mated, that gene combination is different every single time. So, this giraffe here, its parents, the genes were shuffled together and they produced this giraffe. This giraffe down here in the bottom right looks a little bit different. That's because its parents were different. So again, this is all due to, again, what we call genetic recombination. And again, this is a really important thing for a species because it helps the species survive. All right, so remember that, really important. And now back to mutations. Mutations, you might remember this from biology. There are things in the environment, for example, that can cause mutations. Things like radiation and chemicals and viruses. Sometimes they just happen spontaneously, but sometimes they're caused by environmental factors, for example. But again, you guys might remember, your sequences of DNA, right? Your 4 nitrogen bases, thymine and adenine and cytosine and guanine. But this is DNA. It could be your DNA or the DNA in a hippopotamus or whatever. But if there's any mistakes in that DNA, if there's a change, then that can affect the individual. Again, those changes are what we call mutations, and they could cause different proteins to get built, and they could even be lethal in an organism. So that could be a really bad thing. They can also be kind of helpful. Here's an example here of a mutation that really isn't very good. I mean, this is what we call a dusty-headed conure. It's a bird that lives in the tropical rainforest, whatever. And normally it's this kind of greenish color, which you would think, for a bird living in a forest, like a tropical rainforest, that's probably a really good color to be, right? But there's a mutation that occasionally happens, in the offspring that causes the feathers to turn blue. So if that mutation occurs, that's probably not very good. I mean, think about this bird here, living in a tropical rainforest, amongst a bunch of green, foliage and leaves. I mean, he kind of sticks out like an apple in an orange barrel. So he's probably going to get plucked off by some predator, or some larger bird or whatever, right? So, in that aspect, mutations can, be kind of detrimental for certain individuals in the species. They can also kind of be helpful in a way. Um, Here's a really interesting example. This is called sickle cell anemia. Maybe you've heard of this disease before, but over here is just kind of some background about what sickle cell is, and what's kind of an interesting thing about it. This very last bullet here, it says it's a very common genetic disorder amongst African Americans. It says 1 in 400 African Americans will actually have this disease, which is a much higher incidence than any other race or group of individuals or subgroup of people in our country. So there's kind of a reason why that is, and it has kind of an evolutionary spin to it. So again, if you're not familiar with the disease, sickle cell anemia is caused by a mutation that causes the red blood cells to be misshapen. So, for example, here's like a normal red blood cell. They're kind of like these disc shapes, and they travel real easily through your blood vessels and whatever if you have normal blood cells. People who have sickle cell, the mutation actually causes the blood cell to be abnormally shaped, and those abnormal cells don't travel very well through your blood vessels, which is why people with sickle cell have a lot of these cardiovascular problems like strokes and high blood pressure and things like that. Now, the thing about this mutation, which what kind of makes it a little bit interesting, is in certain areas of the world, having this mutation, which you would think would not be very beneficial at all, but in certain parts of the world, having this mutation is actually kind of a good thing. There's one area of the world, in Africa, where there's a specific disease called malaria. Malaria is caused by a little protist, and it's carried by a mosquito. People who have sickle cell anemia, that live in Africa, I mean, there's no real advantage to that because you have sickle cell. But the one advantage that there is to having sickle cell if you live in Africa is you are completely resistant to malaria. The little parasite, the little protist in the background, you see this is a red blood cell here. The little protist actually infects the red blood cells. But if you have sickle cell, it won't. So imagine if you live in Africa and you have sickle cell, which kind of sucks that you have it, but at least there's some silver lining, I guess. You're, immune to malaria. If you don't have sickle cell, like if you just have normal red blood cells, if you live in Africa, this is not good because you are completely susceptible to malaria, but you don't have sickle cell, so that's kind of good, I guess. But if you look in the middle here, this is the heterozygous condition. These are people who are big A, little a, compared to like homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. But these individuals here, they have some sickle cells, but they don't have all. So they're mildly impacted by sickle cell anemia, just a little bit. They're not like full blown sickle cell, and they're still resistant to malaria. So if you live in Africa, this genotype right here actually is the best advantage for living in a tropical region where this disease is like super duper common. So, I mean, that being said, if you look at this map here, these areas, especially in the central part of Africa, some areas in North America, or South America, Africa, India, some places here, these are areas where there is a very high incidence of malaria transmission. A lot of those mosquitoes live there. And if you look at this map, This says births with sickle cell anemia. So especially these areas in red here, which is again in Africa, this is where most of the people that have sickle cell are actually being born. So, I mean, if you're an African American, if you live over here in the United States, your ancestors can probably be traced back to this area of Africa. So it's probably not unusual to have people of African descent have that gene in their heritage. Now, if you live in North America and you have, the sickle cell gene, let's say you're heterozygous, there really isn't any advantage for you here because malaria is not very common. But if you lived in Africa, it probably would be an advantage to you. So I think that's kind of an interesting trait and how it's kind of passed on. And it's kind of can be traced all the way back sort of to its evolutionary roots. All right, we're going to stop the video here today. We'll pick up with part 2 in the next video.